The morning fog clung to the city like a half-remembered dream when she vanished. April 3, 1993. Baltimore's skyline still slept beneath the violet hush of dawn as Lorraine Wells, a beloved morning anchor with a voice like warm honey, left her townhouse in Fells Point for the studio just 5 miles away. She never arrived. Her coffee cup still steamed in the passenger seat, car door ajar at the base of a wooded embankment off Route 40. No sign of struggle, no broken glass, no footprints in the frost-laced grass, just silence. Cold, breathless silence. What followed was a search that gripped the nation and shattered a newsroom. For 30 years, her disappearance was a ghost story whispered in hallways and spilled across headline retrospectives. And then, in the dusky still of a December courthouse conference room, a trembling voice buried by time and trauma finally spoke. He said her name as if it burned his tongue. "Lorraine," the man whispered, his hands clenched tight in his lap, eyes refusing to lift from the linoleum floor. Bernard Havel, now 64, a retired maintenance worker with arthritic knees and a soul heavy from decades of silence, had never been tied to the case. Until now. His voice cracked on syllables he had once buried beneath layers of denial and guilt, each word scraping against the stillness of the room like gravel dragged across glass. He claimed he saw her, that morning, just before sunrise, standing beside her stalled car near the forest edge, her breath visible in the cold air, her face tense but calm. And then, he remembered the van, an old blue Chevy with rust-scabbed panels, idling too long in the shoulder grass, a detail once dismissed as unremarkable, suddenly charged with quiet menace. He never told police, not then. And now, 30 years later, it might be the thread that unwinds everything. To understand the gravity of Bernard's confession, one must trace the steps of the investigation that followed Lorraine's vanishing, a campaign of desperation lit by the flickering hope of a nation that refused to forget. The search unfolded like an obsession, inch by inch, combing ravines, abandoned barns, and sewers with dogs and floodlights. Helicopters scoured the Chesapeake's muddy banks, while volunteers blanketed Baltimore with flyers marked by Lorraine's radiant smile, now a haunting relic of stillness. Her newsroom family aired nightly appeals, their voices cracking with restrained grief. Surveillance footage from bridge tolls, gas stations, even laundromats was pored over by agents bleary-eyed from caffeine and futility. But every path turned to fog, every clue dissolved like a mirage in the morning heat. The only physical remnant remained her car parked with eerie deliberation, keys stiff in the ignition, seatbelt still fastened as though she'd simply intended to get out and return. And yet Lorraine Wells had evaporated from the earth as effortlessly as dew in sunlight. Then came the theories her boyfriend at the time, a local philanthropist with deep ties to the station, rumors of obsession, of a stalker, a letter postmarked from New York, later debunked as cruel fan fiction. Without evidence, doubt metastasized, and so did silence the cruelest kind, thick like tar, heavy with the things no one dared to name. Lorraine's mother, Evelyn Wells, became the unwilling face of perseverance, her aging features slowly etched with the erosion of hope twisted into ritual. She kept her daughter's room untouched, the floral comforter smoothed tight each morning, the scent of lavender oil refreshed weekly as if Lorraine might walk through the door at any moment. For years, Evelyn stood in press conferences, holding up pictures that the media called archival but she insisted were recent, speaking Lorraine's name into microphones as if summoning her from the void. "She didn't just disappear," Evelyn once said, voice trembling beneath the weight of years and futility. "Someone took her. Someone knows." But as time cruelly pressed on, television segments grew shorter, posters faded in the sun, and cold case files thickened with dust. The world moved on. Evelyn did not. Her finger remained poised over the memory, pressing replay on the last known conversation, the hurried morning goodbye, the door that closed and never reopened. Silence had become her houseguest, grief her only companion. Still, Lorraine's picture stayed on the mantel, smiling, frozen, waiting. But the silence was never complete. Beneath Baltimore's forward momentum, beneath its growling traffic and bustling cafes, there lived an ache, a name that refused to die. Local legend gave Lorraine mythic edges, the morning angel swallowed by shadows. Children of the 90s remembered the face on milk cartons. Newsroom interns whispered stories of the anchor who vanished on her ascent. Her story had become a folklore, mutating in whispers and dim-lit message boards. And through it all, in the bowels of dusty records and unsolved logs, Detective Flora Ramirez never stopped watching. She'd only been a rookie when Lorraine vanished, but her mother had cried watching the news coverage. That cry stuck with Flora like a trespassing dream. 30 years later, gray now streaking her bun and her optimism buried in layers of weary pragmatism, Ramirez was still haunted. So, when Bernard Havel's name crossed her desk with a vague note about a statement concerning the blue van, she leaned forward not out of duty but because the ache had just flickered back to life. Sometimes, it only takes one shiver in the dust to unearth a ghost. Ramirez had seen false leads before. Cranks, attention seekers, those who had convinced themselves they'd seen Lorraine at a diner in Delaware or on a train to Philadelphia. But Bernard's account was different, not in the details alone, but in the weight of them. There was no flair in his voice, no rehearsed timeline or hunger for cameras, just a cracked man dredging memories like stones from a riverbed. He spoke of the screech of tired brakes, the thud of a door, the way Lorraine hesitated, her hand hovering near her purse before the van door opened. Then his voice faltered then. A man emerged, tall, broad, with a ball cap pulled low and movements too smooth to be haphazard. Not a drifter, not confused. No, Bernard kept repeating this detail. He moved like he belonged there, like he had a plan. Ramirez found herself staring at the statement transcript long after Bernard left. She circled the phrase again and again. He moved like he belonged there. Those 6 words, simple, terrifying, set fire to 3 decades of dust. Because in that exact corridor of time, 5:12 to 5:20 a.m., just before the anchor desk lit up without Lorraine, a delivery van registered to a private security consultant named Warren Koch, once employed for station events, was logged exiting Route 40. It had never been cross-referenced, not once, not until now. She pulled the old file herself that night, alone in the bowels of the records room, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead trembling like nerves beneath skin. Coach's name was there. How had they missed him? A benign note in a forgotten margin listed his job. Freelance logistics for the station, mostly signage and crowd control for fundraising galas and family events. No criminal record, no complaints, no red flags. But in 1993, he had access. Maps of broadcast routes, schedules, names. And, as she now discovered buried in a faded roster sheet, he'd been working a station event exactly 1 week before Lorraine disappeared. That's where she saw him smiling, in a grainy photo, Lorraine in mid-laugh behind a podium, and Warren Koch, 2 rows back, arms crossed, his stare just barely out of place. Ramirez leaned in. The smile on his face wasn't joy. It was possession. And suddenly, the darkest theory, the one whispered and discarded for decades, stirred again. What if Lorraine hadn't vanished randomly? What if someone from inside had been waiting all along? Ramirez knew she couldn't bring her suspicions to the department just yet, not without proof, not with Coca's file as unblemished as polished glass. So she dug deeper. Old station logs, security badges, personnel shifts, each one a brittle breadcrumb from a forgotten trail. What she found set her pulse to a dull roar. Lorraine had filed a quiet HR report just weeks before her disappearance. It never made it far misplaced, redacted, ultimately dismissed as a misunderstanding. But the language was unmistakable, unwanted attention from external contractor. The name was blacked out, but the date aligned perfectly with a subcontract period listing Koch's employment. Ramirez stared at the paper until her eyes burned. And in that burn, memory flooded back a younger version of Lorraine, confident and warm, always early to set, often walking alone in the pre-dawn dark. Vulnerable, but trusted, too much so. Somewhere amid the radiant glow of her rising stardom, someone had marked her path. The silhouette of the man in the van was no longer faceless. And Ramirez, her breath catching like a whisper against glass, realized the harrowing possibility. Lorraine had seen him coming, maybe even knew him, and in that final moment, she understood the betrayal. The van hadn't come out of nowhere. It had come for her. As Ramirez stood in the records room holding the faded HR report, she felt the entire narrative shift under her feet, like stepping onto thin ice and hearing the first crack. Lorraine had tried to speak, in the fraction of ways women often do when danger disguises itself in plain sight, through carefully chosen words, veiled warnings embedded in protocol. But no one had listened. Or worse, they had, and done nothing. Ramirez felt a slow, rising fury fuse with something colder resolve. In silence, she returned to her desk, cross-referencing every logbook, every staff roster from that month, even service contracts preserved in mold-speckled boxes marked non-critical. The pattern began to sharpen. Koch had been present at multiple early morning prep days when Lorraine's car had also been flagged entering station grounds. He wasn't assigned to those shifts. And in one chilling discovery, a boiler maintenance log signed by him for a building across town showed a timestamp wildly contradictory with his badge entry near Lorraine's station. The lie was subtle, buried, but it was there. She picked up her pen, heart pounding like the sound of footsteps on wet pavement, and scrawled one word at the center of her legal pad: predator. In the weeks that followed, Ramirez operated like a woman possessed. Quietly, methodically, she built a timeline the original task force had never imagined. Each faded file she unearthed, each half-legible time log, added another fracture in the pristine image Warren Koch had built for himself. His absence of criminal history was no longer a shield, it was camouflage. She traced his work history post-1993, a series of relocations, brief contracting gigs, always skirting the perimeter of public events, never staying long enough for roots or suspicion. One particularly unnerving detail emerged. In 1997, Koch had been fired from a temp agency in Pittsburgh. No official reason listed, just a note: boundary violation, female staff discomfort. No charges, no follow-up. Ramirez stared at the ink, heart sinking beneath the weight of decades of systemic failings. Then, a journalist's archived photo surfaced an award gala in '93, days before Lorraine disappeared. Lorraine radiant in a red satin dress, laughing toward someone just out of frame. In the corner, reflected in a mirror behind her, stood Koch, watching, smile absent, eyes fixed. The mirror captured what no one else saw: the image of a man who wasn't clapping, wasn't mingling, just waiting for something only he knew was coming. And so, Ramirez did what no one else had dared. She visited him. The knock echoed through the quiet of a modest tract home, nestled between overgrown hedges and the sagging wounds of time. Warren Koch opened the door slowly, one hand still gripping the handle, as though he might slam it shut with the force of denial alone. His hair was thin, gray at the temples, but his eyes, those same eyes that bored through mirrored glass in 1993, hadn't aged a day. Not really. For a moment, they regarded her with calm calculation, and then a flicker recognition, perhaps. She introduced herself casually, just a detective revisiting a cold case. When she mentioned Lorraine, he didn't flinch. He simply blinked, slow and glacial. "That was a sad thing," he said flatly. But the air shifted. Ramirez felt the chill of the unseen, the way silence clung to the walls like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. She glanced through the cracked door behind him, boxes stacked like barricades, shelves littered with clipped newspapers, old VCR tapes labeled with dates. A life lived in containment, a shrine to memory or obsession. And that's when she knew she wasn't looking at a man haunted by a mystery. She was looking at the keeper of it. Ramirez did not arrest him that day. She left Koch's porch with a tension swirling in her chest, a storm gathering in silence. To build a case that could withstand scrutiny, she needed more than flickering eyes and mirrored images, more than vanished timestamps and half-buried HR complaints. She needed the connective tissue that binds suspicion into truth. So she turned to the one person left in the shadows, Bernard Havel. The old man sat under a flickering light in the interrogation room, skin pale as parchment, the weight of decades slumped across his spine. Ramirez placed a grainy photo in front of him. The gala, 1993. The mirror, Koch. She didn't ask. She waited. Slowly, Bernard leaned in, eyes trembling. "That's the man," he whispered, voice hollowed out by certainty. "That's the man who stepped from the van." Ramirez exhaled, the breath catching like winter wind against stained glass. 30 years lost to silence, denial, and oversight, and now, finally, the past was beginning to speak. Bernard's words spread like wildfire through the precinct, fueling a renewed energy that felt nearly sacred. Ramirez, against procedure but driven by a pull deeper than protocol, filed an urgent request for a re-examination of the van logs from that April morning. Hidden in the faded microfilm of toll booth records sat a single video clip from a westbound industrial corridor, blurry, distorted, but unmistakable. A blue van crawling to a stop, the driver briefly illuminated under a sodium light. Koch. Unmistakably Koch, glancing up at the camera with a ghost of a smirk before accelerating into shadow. That image became gospel, that face, a reckoning, But the most damning piece would come not from camera or corridor, but from deep within the archive of WBLT, the station where Lorraine had shaped history with every dawn. An intern, combing through unlabeled tapes stored in a forgotten closet during a routine digital conversion, loaded a reel marked simply Pre-roll Backup 93. It began unremarkably, color bars, tone, then flicker. Lorraine, caught candid in studio, wrapping a scarf around her neck as she prepared to head home on March 27th. Background chatter, laughter, and then her smile faltered. She turned her head quickly, eyes narrowing, not playful, not amused. Off camera, a voice low, male, inaudible. Her hand gripped the scarf tighter. Her body subtly shifted, defensive. Then the footage cut to black. But something had just scratched the surface of the final week she walked the earth. The van was real. The stare was real. The fear was real. And the man waiting outside the frame had been practicing invisibility long before camera shutters ever knew his name. The footage jolted Ramirez awake in ways sleep never could. She replayed it again and again, dissecting every nuance of Lorraine's expression, every shift in posture. It was instinctive, not performative. A woman sensing the storm before it breaks. That final week, March 27th to April 3rd, had always existed as a haze of unconfirmed timelines and dead ends. But now, with this living sliver of unearthed tape, something vital cracked open. Ramirez pulled every broadcast, every behind-the-scenes cut scrap she could find. At 6:42 a.m., on March 29th's segment, Lorraine paused after sign-off, glancing to stage left, lips parting as if to speak, then choosing not to. On April 1st, her tone was tighter. The usual warmth carried a trace of distance, her smile practiced, haunted by something just off camera. And on her final night, April 2nd, she signed off the way prophets deliver last words measured, deliberate. "See you all bright and early," she had said, but her eyes flickered like she already knew she wouldn't. Ramirez wrote it down, a timeline not of events but of unraveling. She knew, she whispered into the quiet, and in that confession, a terrible clarity bloomed. Lorraine hadn't just been taken. She had been waiting for someone to notice, to believe her, to stop what was coming, and no one had, until now. With this knowledge burning in her, Ramirez made the call that could end her career or finally bring peace to 3 decades of grief. A formal request for a warrant. Surveillance was requested. Not aggressive, but close enough to catch Warren Koch in the quiet moments where masks slip. Over the next several days, Ramirez watched from a silent distance as Koch repeated patterns: morning walks, timed precisely, slow drives past industrial parks long abandoned, and once, most chillingly, a shoulder-length stare at an old photo display outside WBLT's newly remodeled lobby. Her face was still there, Lorraine, mid-laugh, immortal in print. And Koch, he just stood, unmoving, lips shifting in what might have been the echo of a smile. The trap was closing, but Ramirez wasn't hunting a man anymore. She was stalking the embodiment of decades of silence, of all those who never looked deeper. What Lorraine had endured, what she had tried to warn them of, none of it was distant anymore. In those final tapes and quiet glances, Lorraine hadn't vanished without a trace. She had left a map. And now, after all these years, someone was finally reading it. The trap was nearly set when something unexpected unfolded. On the evening of April 5th, just as dusk spilled amber light across Baltimore's worn streets, Warren Koch made a sudden, uncharacteristic move. He packed his car, 2 suitcases, a small lockbox, and what appeared to be a tightly bound stack of portfolios. Surveillance caught the motion. Ramirez saw it from the feed, a fluttering detail that screamed urgency, not flight but preparation. It was as if he felt the walls closing in, as if some flicker of instinct or paranoia tipped him off. Ramirez didn't wait. With the warrant now in hand, she mobilized the task force. When they approached the house just after midnight, the porch light was still on. But inside, amid the cluttered quiet, lay the final, brutal punctuation to a mystery that had scarred a generation. Koch sat in his living room chair, hands open, eyes vacant, and beneath the floorboards, wrapped in faded broadcast scripts and sealed plastic sleeves, law enforcement discovered what they had never dared hope to find: Lorraine's press ID, fragments of clothing, a cassette tape marked, "For Evelyn." The silence shattered, at last, into the roar of truth. And for the first time in 30 years, the morning sky bore witness not to a vanishing, but a reckoning and a return. The cassette was brittle in Ramirez's gloved hands, as if the weight of memory had aged the tape beyond its years. Forensics would later confirm that it was Lorraine's voice on the recording, tired, measured, but unbroken. The tape began with silence, faint studio sounds in the distance, a chair creaking, a breath inhaled. Then, "If anything happens to me, don't let them call it an accident." Her words cut across decades like glass through water. She named no one. She made no accusations. But what lingered in her voice was conviction, a quiet urgency blooming into heartbreaking clarity. This wasn't paranoia, it was foresight. She knew. In the days that followed, press conferences crackled with stunned voices, the newsroom shuttered their morning broadcast for the first time in its history, and Evelyn Wells, now white-haired and slower in her steps, stood before a sea of microphones and did not weep. "She never stopped speaking," Evelyn said, holding her daughter's photo one last time, the tape clutched tight in her aged fingers. "We just weren't listening." And the sky behind her, for the first time in 30 years, surrendered the weight of silence to the rising song of justice, fragile, unwavering, morning breaking after the longest of nights. Lorraine Wells's story didn't end beneath floorboards or fade with the final rattle of cassette tape. It lived in every woman told to smile through discomfort, in every dismissed whisper logged under misunderstanding. Ramirez, standing outside Evelyn's home weeks after the case had closed, watched autumn leaves spiral in slow descent like memories refusing to settle. She had questions still about who else knew, who else remained hidden behind redacted lines and sealed HR files. But for now, the truth had surfaced, scarred and incomplete, yet undeniable. A plaque would soon be placed at WBLT's entrance, a dedication not to a television anchor, but to a woman who refused to disappear quietly. Beneath the inscription, Evelyn requested 4 words etched in bronze. She warned, we heard. And in the hush that lingered before sunrise, as morning light stretched across a city too long shadowed, Lorraine's voice soft, certain seemed to echo once more through time's unraveling veil. "Tomorrow's coming? I'm still here." In the years that followed, Lorraine Wells became more than a headline or a tragedy. She became a catalyst. Universities cited her case when teaching journalism ethics and gender-based workplace protections. Advocacy groups invoked her name during policy debates on harassment reporting mechanisms. Ramirez, once a lone voice in a room of old silence, was invited to speak before congressional panels about systemic failures hiding beneath bureaucratic shrug-offs and paper-thin protocols. But it was Evelyn's quiet resilience that left the deepest mark. She donated Lorraine's archived footage to the Women's History Museum, along with the scarf from her final studio segment, still scented faintly of lavender. The case files, now publicly unsealed, lined the glass of a memorial exhibit titled "The Vanished Who Spoke." Visitors touched her press ID through layers of plexiglass, mothers whispered her name to daughters, and somewhere, in the blue hush of early morning, anchors across the country paused before the red light blinked live, remembering her not as a ghost, but as a guide. Not vanished, not silenced, but heard, finally, in full. Still, under all the closure and public tribute, the city carried her shadow in the threads of sunrise. The old Route 40 embankment, once just a nameless slope, became a quiet pilgrimage site. Flowers left not just in grief, but in gratitude. Local artists began painting her face among murals of resilience, a rising sun woven into her silhouette. And once a year, during the week of April 3rd, the station Lorraine helped build turned off their cameras for 1 full minute of silence. No broadcasts, no jokes, no lead-ins, just breath, just memory. Evelyn, who passed peacefully in her sleep 2 winters later, had left behind reels of home video for Ramirez scenes of a younger Lorraine dancing barefoot across hardwood floors, reading scripts out loud to the cat, laughing with a freedom that now belonged to posterity. And as Ramirez watched those old films in a darkened room, she understood something she'd never fully grasped before. Justice isn't always a sentence or a cell. Sometimes, it's the act of witnessing, of refusing to look away, of saying someone's name until the world finally listens. Lorraine Wells did not vanish. She waited. And now, in the reverent hush of morning, she remains not just as a memory, but as a message, a voice still speaking, clear as dawn. Years later, a child born in the very same neighborhood where Lorraine once walked to work would ask his mother, "Who was that lady in the morning sky mural?" And she would tell him not with tears, but with reverence. She'd say Lorraine Wells was light that never dimmed, a voice that warned, a story that waited until the world grew brave enough to hear it. And in classrooms, courtrooms, and quiet living rooms across the country, her name would ripple like wind through tall grass, gentle, persistent, impossible to silence. The justice she was denied in life found voice through the relentless echoes of those who refused to forget. And though the forest may have swallowed her footsteps, it could not quiet her truth. Lorraine became not the woman who vanished, but the one who taught a nation how to see what hides in plain sight. Her story, once constructed of shadows, now ended in dawn. And so it was that Lorraine Wells, whose face once flickered across televisions, as morning's promise was etched forever into a nation's conscience. Her story no longer belonged to the mystery, the folklore, or the failure of systems that forsook her. It belonged to the shift the tectonic realignment stirred by one voice too powerful to bury. Teachers held her story up as a testament to vigilance. Legislators cited her legacy when voting on reforms designed to protect the unseen, the unheard. Her name became a prayer and a reckoning, whispered by those who understood that silence is never neutral. In the hush before every sunrise, in the moment before the red light blinks live and voices rise to meet the day, there exists a breath, a pause for Lorraine. A vow stitched into time itself, never again forgotten, never again muted. She walked toward the morning, and it met her finally with light. Eventually, the house on Fleet Street where Lorraine once lived was bought by a young couple, unaware at first of its history, but as word reached them, they chose to preserve its memory rather than erase it. They left the bay window open every morning, adorned only with a vase of fresh tulips, her favorite flower, noted once in an old interview. The new owner, a poet unaware of her own reasons, found herself waking at dawn, compelled to write with the news on in the background. Over time, the home became not a place of loss, but of echo's testament that even the deepest wounds can shape beauty in their wake. Outside, the city moved with greater awareness now. Billboards no longer carried just smiles, but safety hotlines. Studios implemented new protocols, ones that bore Lorraine's name in footnotes and folded policy handbooks. And where the silence had once deafened, now stood a hum of vigilance. Lorraine's story had not only unearthed the past, it had rewritten what the future could be. And in that reworking, amid the brokenness, and afterward, she was there. Still walking toward the light, never fading, always seen. And perhaps this is what survival looks like when time itself cannot undo what was lost. Not the return of what vanished, but the bloom of something solemn and enduring in its place. Lorraine Wells became a thread in the city's fabric, no longer just a name whispered through unsolved directories or late-night reruns, but a symbol carved into Baltimore's collective heartbeat. Some say they still feel her presence along the soft light of pre-dawn streets, where her heels once clicked in rhythm with ambition and grace. Teachers place her name beside lessons of truth and resilience. Journalists invoke her memory when navigating stories laced with risk. And for one girl, walking into her first newsroom decades later, wide-eyed and clutching a faded charm bracelet once sold to support Lorraine's search fund, there is a knowing sense of inheritance. Lorraine's legacy is not measured only in justice served or policies passed, but in the quiet revolution of remembrance in the way her footsteps, though erased from soil, echo still in every path, walked with eyes open, with hearts listening, with voices brave enough to speak. That bracelet, the one clasped around the wrist of the girl entering the newsroom, sparkled faintly under fluorescent lights, its tiny charms jingling like fragments of a lullaby passed down through mourning and memory. Handmade by Evelyn in the aftermath of Lorraine's disappearance, each sold charm had not been just a plea for support but a thread in a larger tapestry of resistance. Now, decades later, that same bracelet adorned a new generation, a quiet inheritance from a woman who once spoke through the camera lens with steadiness even in fear. This girl, whose name mattered less than her presence, stepped into the anchor booth not to replace Lorraine, but to continue her. And as the red light blinked on, she took a breath, lips poised, heart steady. Outside, Baltimore stirred with the first hum of dawn. And inside that studio, once silenced by grief, a voice rose clear, confident, resilient. Not Lorraine's, but born of her. And through that voice, and every voice that followed, Lorraine Wells spoke still through courage, through memory, through time itself. The woman who vanished was never truly gone. She had only been waiting to be found in the light. And so, in the breath between breaking stories and rising sun, Lorraine's journey settled not as a disappearance, but as a continuum. Her life, her loss, and her voice were no longer buried in case files or whispered in doubt. They lived instead in policies changed, in voices raised, in every moment when someone dared to speak up instead of stay silent. The mystery that once cloaked her in tragedy had opened into something far greater, a movement born from the embers of injustice. Lorraine Wells became the space between silence and speech, the flicker of clarity before morning fully breaks. Her story, layered in pain and hope, lingered like morning fog, soft, insistent, unforgettable. She did not vanish into myth. She rose into legacy, and in every newsroom that dares to listen, every mother who tells her daughter to believe her instincts, every city that lays flowers where silence once stood, Lorraine walks again, unbowed, enduring, eternal in the light. And in that light, where closure once seemed impossible, Lorraine's memory became a compass for those navigating their own shadows. Survivors stepped forward, quietly at first, then louder, echoing her strength. News stations reevaluated not only their safety protocols but their culture. Conversations once buried in shame and neglect found air to breathe. Lorraine Wells, once a name swallowed by uncertainty, emerged as a voice shaping the conscience of a nation. Her journey from silence to resonance wrote itself across time not as a tragedy alone, but as an anthem of awakening. In the quiet places, where grief once rooted deep, there now bloomed understanding, and where the world had failed to hear her once, it now refused to stop listening. The woman who disappeared into morning's mist returned, not in form, but in the courage she seeded across decades. And every future voice that dares to speak, every story reclaimed, bears her whisper steady, luminous, unbroken, guiding the truth toward dawn. And long after headlines faded and ceremonies concluded, Lorraine Wells remained not in the tragedy that once defined her, but in the quiet choices people made in her name. A journalist choosing to report the uncomfortable truth. A producer pausing to check in with a colleague. A manager listening, truly listening, when someone said they felt unsafe. Her story threaded into these moments like starlight into a night sky, subtle but unmissable. On April mornings when cherry blossoms whispered against the sidewalks of Fells Point, her image on weather-worn murals smiled not in mourning but in legacy. The tape she left behind still played in journalism classrooms, her words now a sacred litany. If anything happens to me, a warning turned witness, soft as breath, hard as history. And so, beneath city lights and breaking news, in every voice daring to speak through fear, Lorraine's spirit moved undaunted, undimmed, impossibly alive. Not a vanishing, a return, not a silence, a song. And maybe that is how legends are truly born, not from fame or finality, but from the enduring pulse of remembrance. Lorraine Wells did not vanish alone into that cold April morning. She carried with her every voice that had been silenced, every instinct ignored, every warning that fell like a leaf unheard. And in the stillness her absence created, a new sound emerged, truth spoken without fear. Her life proved that even when lost, a soul determined to be seen will carve its way through time, leaving behind something stronger than answers, awareness. And so her story closes not with darkness, but with vigilance, not with sorrow, but with clarity. Lorraine walks with every step we take toward justice, with every voice rising steady in the hush of morning, and with every promise that silence will never again be mistaken for stillness. She was taken. She was warned. She warned us. And now, she leads. And so the screen fades not to black, but to morning. Not an ending, but light spilling across faces once bowed in grief, now lifted in remembrance. Lorraine Wells became what no absence could diminish, a presence etched in vigilance, in love, in every corner where truth chose to stand its ground. Her story carried warnings, yes, but also maps for all who would dare to follow, to see what others missed, to speak even when the world turns away. The girl who walked into dawn and never came home has become the very shape of home for countless others, a name wrapped in reverence, a legacy soft as morning fog, fierce as the first rays of sun. As the newsroom red light pulses and coffee steams in quiet corners, someone always remembers. And as stories rise to meet each new day, Lorraine's voice threads through them, still a whisper woven into the waking. Not a disappearance, a dawn. In the quiet of tomorrow, somewhere between the first hint of color in the sky and the rustle of a city rising to life, a voice lingers unshaken by time, immune to fading. Lorraine Wells's journey ended not with mystery, but with meaning. What once began as a tragedy unknown found resolution, in truth made visible, and in courage reborn every time fear is faced head-on. Her final gift was not just justice or remembrance, but a mirror held up to a world once too preoccupied to see. And now, in that mirror, we glimpse more than a past reclaimed. We see the roads we must still walk, the voices we must still honor, the silences we must break. Lorraine Wells, morning anchor, vanished soul, unwavering presence. Her name a lighthouse in the haze, her legacy a promise that even in the darkest silence, truth waits to rise like the sun. And the morning, always, will remember her. And as the light crests the skyline one more time, folding across rooftops and glinting off window panes, Lorraine's name lingers not as a question, but as a vow. No longer just the face from old broadcasts or case files, she is now part of the morning itself, a pulse beneath the surface of every story, told with courage, every truth unearthed despite resistance. Her final legacy is this: a cultural seam opened wide, stitched together with empathy, vigilance, and refusal. In every newsroom light flickering to life, in every soft footstep chasing the day before it forgets itself, she is there. Lorraine Wells didn't disappear into silence. She transformed it. She turned it into echo, into witness, into fire. And through the years, the fog, the time lost and reclaimed, her whisper endures where all stories begin with dawn, with voice, with the insistence of light. Now, as the sun rises once more over Baltimore and brushes its golden fingertips across the window panes of a city forever altered, Lorraine Wells stands not among the lost but among the immortal. Her life, and the echoes it stirred, did more than solve a mystery. They awakened a reckoning, reshaped a culture, and birthed a call that spread across generations. In newsrooms where silence once stifled truth, her story whispers with power. In living rooms and classrooms, it teaches grit wrapped in grace. And in every heart that daringly tells its truth, despite fear or disbelief, her voice carries forward soft but steady, the cadence of a woman who saw the storm and dared to speak. So in the hush before each new dawn, listen closely. That sound beneath the hum of the waking world, that's Lorraine. Still walking, still speaking, still light. And in light she remains, not merely in legend or learning, but in the lived truth of those who carry her forward, not as a memory weighted by sorrow, but as a compass forged in resilience. The mural of her silhouette on Fleet Street now bears a quiet line at its base, added hands trembling, years after the case had closed. She walked ahead, so others could follow with eyes open. There is no final frame, no ultimate closing act to what Lorraine became. She exists in continuity, in every silence now filled by courage, in every hesitant step taken without apology. Her vanishing was a spark, her voice a flame. And now, in every flicker of morning that breaks through the quiet, she answers the darkness not with farewell, but with a call to rise. Lorraine Wells, forever walking into the day, not lost, not gone, just leading the way home. And as home finally comes into view, not as brick or street, but as justice, as visibility, as empathy, Lorraine's story nestles into the fabric of the living. Hers is not merely a tale retold, but a course corrected. A woman once lost in the hush before daybreak now lives in the hearts of those who refuse to blink when darkness draws near. In every truth told bravely, in every silence shattered with care, in every red light blinking before a broadcast begins, Lorraine Wells rises again, not disappeared, not alone, but luminous, eternal, and walking beside us all. The morning that once mourned her now carries her forward, and in that light she is home. So let her name endure beyond memory, drifting on the winds that move through studio hallways and quiet city streets before the sun stretches its arms across the world. Lorraine Wells, not merely the woman who once vanished, but the truth we finally chose to hear. In every morning newscast, in every whispered instinct now afforded a listening ear, she speaks. Not a voice reclaimed, but one never truly lost. And in that, perhaps, lies the most costly and beautiful truth of all. When we listen, truly listen, those the world tried to forget become its fiercest guides. Lorraine didn't vanish. She became the reason we finally opened our eyes.